company. So, but anyways, we can't help it because things at times become quite different. So we'll have to change with those situations and accordingly adapt according to the requirements and everything. So that is the need of the hour, as we say. And change is one which is always inevitable. We cannot escape change, and even if we try to escape, we would be obsolete, and there would be no importance, no value proposition in terms of our requirement compared to the work that we are doing. So at time, though certain things can be managed, but here I'm not sure like what is the objective. So maybe they want to complete everything on weekend, and then they want to utilize resources for support function, support work. That could be the only underlying objective which I can make out by looking at this thing. I don't think any other thing, because they want to utilize as many it is. Are they would they be paid something for this training? Any idea or support?
No, sir. No, sir.
Nothing.
Yeah,
Okay.
nothing.
Okay. Okay.
सर एक चीज पूछनी थी
That
आप.
way it is.
हेलो.
हाँ जी.
सर
Yeah,
आप कहते
go
हैं कि
ahead.
कोई एक आपके कोई एक स्टूडेंट भी सिलेक्शन हुआ है इसमें सेक्सो बैंक में.
Gupta hai. He was one of my previous batches student. So he has also
क्या
been
नाम
placed at Sexo.
क्या नाम बताया सर?
Manan Gupta.
ओके. सो
Manan
वो कुछ और
yeah.
प्रोफाइल कोई और होगी फिर.
हाँ, उसका आई गेस सेटलमेंट्स में हुआ है.
Okay.
हाँ क्या वो?
Okay, Marticus page on LinkedIn. They had showed up their post on Manan Gupta.
Okay. So he was one of my students from the previous batches, which happened in April or May, around April and May 2018. 2019, not 18, 2019. So, and in the same batch, there was one more guy who was selected for RBS, Ayush Gautam. So he was from that batch. Yeah. So I guess he has started. He on Monday as you guys joined. So he has started doing training and everything.
Okay.
But I guess his team would be different than yours, because he was telling me he has gotten into payments and settlement kind of thing. So that way I can think of his team would be different than yours. All right. So guys, today we would be starting with another chapter. So I will also be showing you some of the videos which I have, maybe, or we will see, like, if we have time, then probably I can talk about these stuff that I have with me, which is on the portal which I use, so I can show you that. But before that, I'll just open up with the presentation, and then we will be talking about this thing that I have already with me. Okay, let me just log into the.
Sir, you haven't shared the slides, sir. Actually, sorry.
Oh yeah. I'll send that maybe today only, because I forgot to send it to you guys. Give me a second. Maybe first let me send that particular. So this PPT which I'm sending to you, it has got your KYC AML regulation, the one we were talking about we were talking about last time. So it covers almost all the regulations which are broadly applicable for the US, uh, broadly applicable at the US jurisdiction, and also at the international, because when you talk about US has a lot of work to do with other countries also. So even if there are countries who are associating or working with United States, then they also need to be abiding by those regulations, and they need to bear in their minds that they are in compliance with the laid down regulations which are followed at the United States. Okay, let me just send it to you. That is taking a bit of a time. Okay. What is your email ID code?
APOO
APOO
RV
RV
Sachdeva
Sachdeva
SSCA
SA DEVA
3 @gmail.com.
three is numeric, right?
3. 3.
At gmail.com. Okay.
सर आपके यहाँ भी रामायण चल रही है शायद.
यहाँ पर there are people very fond of watching Ramayana, and during these lockdown period, Ramayana has really become quite popular, and it has gained huge like huge audience in terms of watching this show, which was quite an old, and people thought like initially it would not be likened by the people. However, if you look at the fan following, it has really gone up.
सर TRP भी बहुत बढ़ गई है इसकी.
रामायण से ज्यादा
TRP
अच्छा
has
महाभारत है।
gone like, हाँ वैसे ये तो है।
बहुत ज्यादा
And
इंटरेस्टिंग है ये।
Ramayana is look at in contemporary times, because otherwise maybe the Ramayana was also, yeah. So if you look at the uh, two literature, or maybe the not the literature I will say, because this was something related to religious literature, I'll say. Yeah, mythological religious literature. So that way, out of these two, the one which is more relevant to current times is Mahabharata. It talks about more of the practical things which are applicable in day-to-day life, and how one needs to behave in different situations, and how one needs to be catered to a different requirement at different times. So you cannot behave very similar way in all these situations. You need to tweak your response to the situations that are coming your way. So that is shown in a very greatly presented manner. So that is something one should be one should be learning out of Mahabharata. So if you look at the Krishna's role, that is one of the very well described role. And there you can see that Krishna is not acting as an ideal. He is acting as an individual who is adapting to the circumstances, situations, and that shows it is still relevant in today's time. You cannot be same all the time. You need to be diplomatic. You need to be smart. You need to be, you need to be one who is not spending energy on mundane tasks, on less important activities. One who should be concentrated or prioritizing something that is of higher degree of importance. So that is how things have been projected. If we really go and look at various nuances or various things which are depicted there in this scripture, then definitely you can make it out very clearly. There are a lot of things which have been shown in such a way like they are still relevant in today's time. Okay, so I have sent this PPT. Okay, so I have sent it to Ajay and to Apurv, to Arifa, right, and to others. You guys may send it to Akriti, because I don't find their email ID with me. Maybe it is not coming up in the auto selection. It is not coming up. So maybe you guys can forward this PPT to others also, Neha and Akriti, and yeah, Neha and Akriti. Jeff, I have included Jeff's email ID was appearing in the pop-up. So Jeff, I have included Jeff, Arifa, Apurv, and so Neha and Akriti are left out. So you can maybe forward that.
सर कौन रो रहा है पीछे से?
है? कहाँ पे?
वो कौन रहा है? पीछे से आवाज आ रही ना कोई?
विभीषण रो रहा है ना?
ओके ओके ओके।
विभीषण, हाँ।
तो आपको पता है आजकल वो सब पंडित को ढूंढ रहे हैं, पंडित जी को।
पंडित को क्यों, क्या हुआ?
कि उसने कहा था ना कि शादी के लिए शुभ मुहूर्त बताया था ना, इसलिए।
ओके।
कह रहे हैं कि कहाँ छुप के बैठ गया वो।
ये तो है। You're right. That is the time to look out. These guys who really make very big predictions, big announcements, and nothing actually turns out that way which they think it would be. One second. Okay, so today we would be doing this presentation that is talking about regulatory environment, right? So some of the information would be new and some of the information could be repetitive here also, because it is quite descriptive in that way. So we will be talking about the things that we haven't covered as of now. Okay, so what we would be covering, one is about Dodd-Frank and European market infrastructure regulation. Then we would also be covering about what is MiFID. MiFID is really very huge, so we would be just talking about something which is really important for us, really relevant in current environment. So these are the things that we would be talking in this presentation also. Apart from this, because these things would come a bit later, at a bit later stage, and we would be starting with Basel Accords. So what is Basel, and what is the relevance of Basel? All these things we would be covering in this slide today. And then the other things has been discussed, EMIR, Dodd-Frank and MiFID thing would be covered at the later stage. And this is how this presentation is designed. So Basel Accords, anything that you are knowing about Basel, any one of you? Okay. Okay, no problem. So Basel Accords, yeah, go ahead.
Actually, Basel have their norms marked as 1, 2, 3, in which our country's banking industry has been shown growing or changing with time, and by following regulations, like for first set of regulations, they were different as compared to the second one, and comparing second and third, they both are different on every other stage. So it's just a changing period or a growing period shown by the three regulations, by the three norms so far, and each norm contains as many as 10 to 12 points, in which they are set up. There have been many of the organizations related to banking and particular insight to a particular position, their and things by which they follow, and the country's banking industry is going to follow.
Right, absolutely. So these are the, you can say, as you said, vessel norms are divided into vessel 1, 2, and 3. So as of date, we have 3 vessel norms, so which came in different times. So one came into as of it. So they came at different stages in the history, and they cater to the various banking requirement, and these norms are there to regulate bank and their requirement, given banks work in a setup or in the environment which has lot of risk. So that risk needs to be mitigated in one shape or the other. So that mitigation of risk is well defined, well talked about in these norms, and how that risk can be mitigated. So this is all It's described and detailed in the norms that we're gonna talk about today, right? So, and how it actually came into existence, this is also something we would be talking about. So if we just move on to the slide 4, we see here the banking supervision accords Basel 1, Basel 2, Basel 3 issued by a Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. So there is other way of terming it, Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. So Basel norm, this is a committee of banks, and when I say banks, so they are all central banks. They're all central banks of the various countries. So as of date, there are 27 countries who are part of Basel Committee. In the beginning, when the Basel came into existence, there were only 10 odd countries. When Basel 1 came into existence, there were 10 odd countries who actually made it Basel norms in the beginning. And Basel is a city, it's a place that is based in Switzerland, right? And Switzerland is, as you know, it is in Europe, and it is close to countries like Austria and Germany, right? So this is one, as we know, like this conference or this meeting usually happen in Basel in Switzerland, usually in a year's time, and various G20 members and countries which are part of banking supervision accord, they all go there and talk about various other measures and cooperation they need to do in order to make the financial system more stable, more accountable, more robust. All these things are discussed in the supervision accords while whenever they go and and assemble. So they also do more of the brainstorming. They discuss about more rigorous or more measures or more strong steps they can take to mitigate the risk. So this is something which is done by the banks who are part of the banking supervision committee or banking committee on Basel committee on banking supervision, you can say. Okay, so these three vessel norms, vessel 1, vessel 2, vessel 3, we would be covering in the later slides. So we'll start with the first one. Before that, yeah, currently there are 27 member nations in this committee. This group of central banks is called Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. So as I said, so the member nations who are part of Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, they are the central banks of these respective countries. So they are not they are not they are not the private banks, they are the central banks. So why the central banks, we can very clearly make it out. Central banks, the ones who are responsible for implementing things in their respective countries, right? Central banks are the ones who have owners to get things deployed and implemented in their respective countries. So which is why central banks are important to be part of this committee, not the private bank. If central banks are there, that would be followed by the respective country. It is understood. So this committee started using rules and regulation for banks. These rules are known as Basel norms. So Basel norms, so if somebody asks why it is called Basel norms, so the explanation is because it started in Basel. So with the name of the country, they started the norms also, Basel norms. There is nothing such. At times our people get confused why it is termed as Basel. Basel is because the place where it started. So that is why it is called Basel 1, Basel 2, Basel 3. Okay. Why Basel came about, or how Basel came about rather. A famous example of foreign exchange settlement risk is the failure of Germany's Husted Bank. I guess we talked about this thing earlier in our previous chapter.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
right? So it is the same thing. So how this thing actually came into existence is with the failure of the settlement that happened. So when you say a failure, this is primarily about the credit risk that you have with one entity or the other entity that you're dealing with. So the Basel one that first came into existing, it primarily talk about the credit risk. The credit risk was the agenda in its entire discussion, or in the entire framework that was designed thereafter, post the discussion and everything. The first thing or the foremost of the utmost importance that was there in Basel 1 was the credit risk. So that is what was talked about in Basel 1, and that was because there were a couple of things or a lot of things. This is one of the examples. There was one more that happened in 1970 that was a similar thing. That was also one of the bank's failure. And Hersted Bank, it was a big failure. They were expected to receive euro payment or the dollar payment, and then they were supposed to receive. Husted had taken in all its currency receipts in euro, but had not made any of its US dollar payments when German bank's regulator closed the bank down at the end of German business day. The counterparties were left holding unsecured claims against the insolvent bank's assets. So the bank was supposed to make USD payment, and when we look at the euro payment and the USD payment window, the both windows are different. So every payment has a cutoff time to make it. So euro has a different cutoff time, GBP has a different cutoff time. Euro and GBP more or less same, just an hour difference, not more than that. So euro should be before an hour compared to the GBP payment, and then the USD has a lot of more time to make or to complete the transaction. So this bank was supposed to receive the euro payment from the US based bank, but and supposed to make USD payment. So given they went insolvent, and therefore the USD payment which was to be made, that left in between, and that led to the discussion or to the point, like this kind of a risk is really a very uh, real and serious risk that should be talked about, and there should be some measures and steps taken to avoid such instances, circumstances going forward. Given it is just not limited to one country, it is a risk which is in the entire financial framework across the globe. So that is the reason it became so big, and it was talked about between or among the various banks, central banks rather, I'll say, and therefore this Basel thing came into existence. So why and how it came into existence is this example you can think of whenever there is any question of how and why this came up. So you can really quote this example. There were a lot of credit failures that happened before this Basel 1 came into existence. So that was the trigger point, and uh, that was the main reason how it actually came into existence. So bank were uh, were actually thinking to mitigate such situations, and therefore they thought of coming together and mm, making things more stronger for the banking regulators, and so that they can further go and drill down those things at their respective countries. That is how this thing came into existence, and it was made important and relevant for the entire financial market, global financial market, I will rather say. Yeah. Any point? Okay. Okay. So this thing happened in 26 June in 1974. This failure that we're talking about, this actually happened in 26 June 1974. Okay, so when we move on, here we are talking about this term that is called as capital adequacy ratio, or you can say liquidity ratio. How much a bank can lend, right? So it with this Basel norm, this was the main agenda point. This was the main agenda point. So the capital adequacy ratio shouldn't be less than 10%. It should be at least 10%, or it should be 10% or more. Rather, it was 8% in the beginning, but then it was made 10%. It was 8%, and at times it was tweaked also. At some of the countries follow 8% only as of date also. So when you say capital adequacy ratio, so it is called how it is calculated. We need to look at this thing. That is more important from everyone, for everyone. So capital adequacy ratio is, you can see this example here. So it is calculated with tier 1 capital plus tier 2 capital, then divided by the risk weighted asset. The risk weighted asset, and then it should come out to be 10% or higher. If it is that, if it is equivalent to that, then you are a bank which is working or doing its work under the guidelines of Basel norm 1 or Basel norms. Even the Basel 3 norm also talk about the same capital adequacy ratio. So the capital adequacy ratio that we are looking at here, that is 10%. So what is tier 1 capital? That is, we need to understand. Tier 1 capital, as you can say, that it is the bank own capital, right? Bank own capital, that can be equity and the reserves, disclosed reserves and everything that we talk about, that goes into tier 1 capital, right? And then the bank borrowed capital, you can think of, that is your debt that they have taken, savings, which is their deposits and everything, is called borrowed capital. So the tier 1, you can say the capital and the disclosed reserve which bank has, that is goes into tier 1, and then the tier 2 consists of the borrowed capital which bank has. So when you are calculating CAR, that is capital adequacy ratio, it is basically tier 1 capital plus tier 2 capital, then divided by the risk weighted asset. That is how this capital adequacy is calculated. So capital adequacy ratio shouldn't be less than 8%, this is for sure, and 9% for public sector and 12% for NBFC. And this has been given with respect to Indian scenario, right? So 9% is for public sector and 12% for NBFC, and should not be less than. So globally, this shouldn't be, as per the Basel norm, it is 8% minimum. But if you look at from the public sector Indian point of view, that is 9% for the public sector. And NBFC, so what is NBFC? Any idea what is NBFC? Anything you know about NBFC? NBFS, sorry, no.
Sir, NBFC non-banking. Yeah, go ahead.
Non-banking financial services.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
So any example that you know about and non-banking financial services who are existing right now in our country? Any of
IIFL?
the companies which are, yes, right. IIFL, right? So this is one of the prime example of non-banking financial service category, you can say. Then DHFL, right? Then you can say LIC is also non-banking financial service in a sense, because they also do lending and everything. And so such entities are termed as non-banking financial service. So okay, so capital adequacy ratio is important. We need to be clear. Okay, so you can just maybe you can mute your because there is a lot of background noise which is coming. Usually, what I know is this: there is an option with the presenter also who can mute. I'm just looking at that. All right. So this is important for everyone to be very clear of what is capital adequacy ratio and how this is calculated. So it is calculated basis this formula that is called tier 1 capital plus tier 2 capital, then divided by the risk weighted asset, and the minimum it should be 8%. And if we look at from the Indian banking perspective, then we see it is 9% for public sector bank and 12% for NBFS. Sorry. Okay, so you can see here that is given. In short, banks should not take more risk than required. So tier 1 capital consists of bank's own capital. Tier 2 capital consists of bank's borrowed capital, that is bonds and everything, right? So we would be talking about these three norms today: Basel 1, Basel 2, and Basel 3. So this we can see here when these accords actually came into existence. The first came into existence in 1988. Then the second came into existence in 2004, and 2010 is the third when it came into existence, right? So that is how these.
Sir, I cannot see the slides.
Okay, you're not able to see the slide. Okay, 1 second, just a second. Now is it?
No, sir.
No,
Not
sir.
yet. Okay, 1 second. Let me see 1 second. I guess the share thing is missing then. Let me just create the share again. Okay, now I guess it would be.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes.
Okay, then okay. Maybe it was dropped. I would have clicked somewhere because of that. It was changed. Okay. So what I was talking on this thing. So if you look at this thing here, I was telling you the formula of calculating capital adequacy ratio, and that is important because whenever banks are lending money, they need to be mindful of this formula that is called capital adequacy ratio. They need to maintain this that much amount in spare so that they can take care of their risk and everything. And this capital adequacy ratio is important for all the banks across the globe. And this ratio talks about, if we look at this thing, tier 1 capital plus tier 2 capital divided by the risk weighted asset. This is how this is calculated. And tier 1 is bank's own capital, that is equity, preference share, and the reserves, disclosed reserve which bank has. So everything that goes into tier 1. Then that tier 2 capital has bank's borrowed capital, that can be bonds, it can be deposits, and everything goes into tier 2 capital. And then this are the 3 norms that we're talking about. Okay, so this is a slide I was talking about. So if we look at Basel 1, this came in 1988, and Basel 2 came in 2004, and Basel 3 came in 2010, right? And after Basel 3, there were a lot of top up which were done, because it actually it was to come in 2010, but it actually did not fully come in 2010. So then a lot of things were done, and it finally came in 2013 for some of the countries, and still many of the countries are not following Basel 3 completely. Even India is not following Basel 3 as of date. So it was 2019 when they were supposed to follow Basel 3, but unfortunately they could not follow that. There is a liquidity requirement which they need to fulfill. So that hasn't been followed by Indian banks as well as of date, and it is expected to be followed by 2022. 2022 is the deadline which is set. By then, the banks should be in compliance with Basel 3 norms across the globe. All the countries which are part of the Basel Committee of Banking Supervision, they should be following Basel 3 um, in letter and spirit. So that is the agenda for Basel 3 to be implemented at ground for all the participants of Basel Committee. So, but let's come back to Basel 1 now. The Basel 1 focused on credit risk, right? So this was the main agenda point in Basel norm. Define the capital and structure of the risk weight, and minimum capital requirement fixed at 8% of the risk weighted asset, right? So this is something important. These two terms. One is the credit risk, which was the main agenda here, and then the minimum capital requirement fixed at 8%. So this is also something which everyone needs to remember. The 8% of the risk weighted asset. RWA stands for risk weighted asset. Define capital and structure of risk weight. So here proper definition was created, structure of the risk weights and everything was disclosed. So just an example you can take, maybe there is an assessment which bank does whenever they give a loan to any entity, or for that matter any individual. There is an assessment which is done by a bank, right? And that assessment is, there is a VAR formula, that is called value at risk formula, which banks usually use. So they we will not be going in detail, because valuation at VAR is a very technical and very lengthy formula. And in that formula, we actually bank look at various confidence intervals. So various confidence interval means at the 95% confidence level, what a bank thinks about a person's default or entity's default. 95% chances says that entity would not default, right? So 5% risk chances are there. So that is how the riskiness of various financial entities is assessed by the banks. And so you can say, when you say the risk weighted asset, so the total, if you let's take the tier 1 capital for a bank is 10 million, and the tier 2 capital for the bank is maybe another 10 million. So there is 20 million in total, the capital which bank has, right? So while you are giving a loan of maybe 20 million to one entity which has the riskiness of the riskiness percentage is 25% for that bank, right? 25% for that particular entity, I will say, not bank, that particular entity where you are giving a 20 million loan, the riskiness is 25% or maybe more, 30%, whichever you can think of. And then you are also giving a loan to another entity which is close to 30 million, and there the riskiness is 50%, right? So this is the risk you are calculating. So 20% of 25% of 20 million you will calculate, then 50% of 50% of your another 20 million which you're giving to another entity, and then you calculate. This is called risk weighted asset. This is the risk weighted asset you calculated. So
Sir, can I say something?
yeah.
So I
Hello?
think, sir, I have hello.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, sir, I have in my IPCC level, intermediate level, I have gone through this capital adequacy ratio where we learn about the banking regulations. So where we used to calculate the RWA of a banking. So risk weighted asset, how we calculate it. So what we do is that bank gives does very bank does the investment, give loan to other banks.
Yeah.
So and they have a fixed assets also, acceptance and other things. So what we used to do, we calculate the risk. So for example, there is a fixed asset, so there is 0% of risk. But if the bank has given investment, if bank has invested in a government securities or deposited in a government or RBI, so there will be 0% risk. And if bank has given loan to other banks, so there will be 20% of risk over it. So that's how we used to calculate the RWA. So yeah, so this was.
So yeah, that is how. Right, absolutely. So that is how, right, he rightly said, like this is how you, as in the bank, assesses the risk. So the government securities are the safest one, because if you cannot rely on government, then probably you cannot rely on other things for sure. These government securities, treasuries are the safest one. That is the reason you keep them as less risky or zero risk, you can say, in totality. So, and 25% maybe when you are giving loan to other entities. Similarly, there could be an entity where the risk is higher, so you can accordingly term higher than 25% also. So then you would be calculating all the risk that you have at your balance sheet. So that becomes the risk weighted asset, total risk that you have. And then you divide the entire risk that you have in the balance sheet with the capital that you have. So capital would be your entire tier 1 plus tier 2 capital divided by the risk that you have. That shouldn't be less than, that ratio shouldn't be less than 10%. It should be more than that means if numerator is higher, then only the ratio would be higher, right? The capital is higher, then your ratio would be higher. If the numerator is your capital 1, tier 1 capital and tier 2 capital, if that is less and the risk is more, that ratio would also come less, right? So that is how this thing is calculated. And as he also just said, they for the bank, government bank, government treasuries and RBI, and if you are lending to RBI, reverse repo is the rate that on which we lend to the bank, Reserve Bank. So Reserve Bank can also require money, right? And when you talk about the repo rate and the reverse repo rate, so this is reverse repo rate is applicable when the Reserve Bank is actually getting money, borrowing money from the banks who are in the financial market. So reverse repo is always less than the repo rate. And what was there in yesterday's announcement which RBI made? Did you hear something? 25% cut in reverse repo also.
Yes, sir. Now it is 3.75.
Yeah, so they have made they have said they would be making a cut of 25 basis point, right? 25 basis point means 0.25. So that means Reserve Bank would be taking 2.5 less as in whatever the cut they were taking earlier, so they would be reducing it by 0.25 now. So जैसे
Yes,
मान
and
लो
now
एग्जांपल मैं
now
दूं, अगर
yes, sir.
हाँ, अगर जैसे मान लो मैं आपको 4 रुपए, if I am the RBI and you are the other banks, then if I am lending you with a rate of 4%, example, just taking a wild example, just not for the real scenario, and then I would be, might be I'm taking reverse repo is 3.5. Reverse repo is 3.5. That means I'm taking loan at a less rate than what I'm giving loan to you guys. I'm lending at higher rate and taking the same loan at a less rate. So now that ratio, which is 3.5, it has now come down to 3.75. So that is the rate on which I would be paying to the banks from where I am borrowing money. RBI is borrowing money. So they have made this announcement. Yeah, Ajit, now you go ahead. Yeah, tell me.
No, sir, nothing. It was correct from your side, but just want to say one thing. Now, bank can lend more to the borrower industry now.
Yes. And I guess before this announcement also, there was one more announcement which was done by RBI, wherein this capital adequacy was also changed. You know, this capital adequacy in terms of retail borrower, I guess this and the SME sector, this amount has been changed. The banks are required to maintain a certain level of capital adequacy while they're assessing the risk and everything. So this has also been changed in the last month, the first announcement which RBI made. So there was some announcement for the capital adequacy for certain industry. I'm not recalling which industry it was, maybe the auto industry or some other industries where the threshold was reduced. It was brought down to certain extent. So it is the kind of a relief for the banks. So while if I need to maintain it and 8% of my risk-weighted asset, that means I cannot breach that regulation. I need to be compliant with the overall standard regulation. So that is the Basel 1, which India is also following. And so now moving on to Basel 2, which came into existence in 2004. And so the Basel 1, which was there in 1988, that was there in 2004 also. It is not the things that we talked about in one that was gone and something new things came and introduced in Basel 2. No, it is not like that. So Basel 1 was already there, but over and above, more things were added into Basel 1, right? So what new things were added? That is what we would be looking at in Basel 2. So Basel 2, while we look at these points which are given on the slide, it talks about maintain capital adequacy. So that means the one that we have already talked about in Basel 1 is already there. Better risk management techniques focused on all three types of risk. So as we discussed in Basel 1, the risk agenda was broadly around credit risk, right? But here the risk was around all three risks. So all three risks, the more important three risks that we talk about. So that the three risks broadly are credit, market, and the operational risks. So these three risks we talk about in Basel 2, sorry. So these three risks were talked about. And then we also talked about the mandatory disclosure of risk exposure and everything. So that was in 2004 in Basel 2. We will covering these things in detail in the following slides. Okay. So this was introduced in 88. India adopts Basel 1 in 1999. So in India, this was adopted a bit late, not at the same time when it was proposed and introduced. In India, it came in 1999. Focus almost entirely on credit risk, define capital structure of risk, weights for bank, minimum we've done, right? Okay, so now coming to Basel 2, set of recommendation for regulation in banking industry, Basel 2, which came in 2004. Pillar 1 is minimum capital requirement that was there in Basel 1 also. So that is there. So you can say you can divide Basel 2 in 3 pillars. So that is how people remember it, and it remains very easy to remember also. When you look at Basel 3, Basel 2 and Basel 3, the more or less same. Only difference is Basel 3 is more enhanced than the Basel 2. It went at the industry level or the entity level. It went closer to the industry or entity level with the Basel 3 that we will be talking in the later slides. So Basel 2 primarily talks about one, the capital requirement that we have already discussed, that is the capital adequacy requirement and everything. Then the supervisory review process. So what does it mean? It means the supervisory review process means the bank has to review the requirement if they are actually abiding by those minimum capital adequacy requirement, and if they actually have a robust credit market and operation control or not. So why the market risk became important while we were taking care of capital adequacy requirement in pillar 1. So market risk also became important. Why? Because banks also indulge in market practices. They also do trading. They also invest in such instrument where there is a tendency of those instruments going down, right? If those instruments instruments get devalued, right? So it is an exposure to the overall capital of the bank. It is an exposure to the overall capital of the bank, which was not looked at in Basel 1. So you cannot just go with the one thing, that is credit risk, and assume like everything is hunky-dory. No, you cannot say that way. Because banks, there are other arms of the bank, which is the investment banking firm that deals with instruments which are riskier in nature, and they are governed by the market practices which are following. So banks are also doing certain activities which are leading to trading activity. They are also doing corporate financing, debt financing and everything, right? So if they are loaning certain money to such lenders with the help of other arms which they have other than the commercial arm. Other commercial arm is where the loans are converted when the bank actually has deposits and everything. That's the retail banking arm of the bank. So it was looked at market risk is as important or equally important when we look at the risk which a bank has. So market risk also needs to be mitigated equally. So that is how this market risk came into picture. And when you talk about the operation risk is just about the system failure, and when you're not able to do your job properly. So this was also a risk which was factored in Basel 2. So there, when you look at the pillar 2, supervisory review process actually talks about all these things to be reviewed properly, and then those reviews to be presented to the regulators as and when required, or when. So it should be consisting of an audit requirement at the internal level and an audit requirement at the regulator level. So these things were talked about in Basel 2, that the internal checks or balances which a bank needs to do should be well placed, should be well managed, and the bank should be overseeing those on a regular basis, so that there is no glitches, there are no failures happening to the controls or the supervisory check which a bank should be managing. And at the same time, when there is a requirement of a regulator to go through those audit requirements to review the banking process, so those should be available to the supervisors of the authorities where the bank is operating. So that is the second requirement to this is the pillar 1, capital requirement. 2 is the supervisory review process of all the risks about and the controls and requirements that comes into pillar 2. Then is the market discipline. So market discipline is primarily related to when you're conducting your business. So you should be transparent. You should be transparent with your investors. So you should be disclosing all the information to the investors who are actually dealing with you. So that is called market discipline. So you should not be hiding anything from the investors. So you should be very, very fair and transparent with the investors. So there is a market discipline which you can say is available in the financial market. So that way the whole financial system would be very very strong and would be more well connected, would be more well collected in a sense when there is the information published and can be seen by all other banks and all other investors. Then the banks would have more confidence on their on their counterparts, you can say, or on their other banks which are there in the financial market. And similarly the individuals would be also confident about the banking activities and the bank's condition in the bank's overall role and condition in the financial market, right? So that is how these three pillars came into existence in Basel 3. So you can see this is the change which happened in Basel 2. Okay. Anything, any question maybe you have, anything that comes to your mind right now?
No, sir.
No, sir, no question.
Okay, fair enough. So guys, with this I pause for 5 minutes. Maybe we can just take a quick breather for 5 minutes and then we can come back at we can meet at 10:20. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. So I'm just pausing here.
सर आपकी आवाज नहीं आ रही। हेलो 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 हेलो। कपूर तू कुछ बोलियो भाई, क्या पता मेरे में प्रॉब्लम है क्या।
नहीं नहीं
Sir is not talking.
सर
So
की
शायद me.
ओके Hello, hello, check 1 2 4 1 2 4 1 2 4. Hello, 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 hello.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. We can hear you, sir.
Okay.
Can you
I
hear
don't
us,
know
sir?
what was the. Yes, I can also hear you guys. I can hear you. Yeah. Okay.
Okay.
Let me share your. Let me ask him to make me the presenter. Karan को बोलता हूँ. Give me a second. Okay, guys. So we are back. So I guess now it is audible to everyone. All right. Okay, great. So we were looking at this slide and we were talking about the differences that we have in both the norms now that we have. The one is the Basel 2 and Basel 3. Basel 1, it was primarily focused on credit risk and then also the capital requirement which a bank should have. And bank Basel 2 also talked about we talked about the capital requirement which bank should have, and at the same time also we talked about the various other risks which a bank has, operational, credit, and market risk. Those were also talked about, and then those were clubbed into the supervisory review process, and then disclosure and the market discipline is also talked about, wherein the bank should be very very transparent to the investors and the various counterparts in the financial market, so that it is considered to be a market discipline practice. You are very disciplined and focused and not hiding anything from the market. So that was into Basel 2, now Basel 3. So Basel 3, if we look at this slide here, we can see enhanced minimum capital requirement and liquidity requirement is mentioned here. So when we talk about enhanced minimum capital requirement, so in Basel 2, when we were talking about tier 1 and tier 2 capital and the risk weighted asset, when we were talking about these things, so it was said bank need to set aside 4% of tier 1 capital and the 4% of tier 2 capital, right? And we know what tier 1 and tier 2 capital is. Tier 1 capital is primarily bank's own equity, preference share, and the reserve which bank has. That goes into tier 1 capital, and tier 1 capital is the borrowed money which bank has got. So it is the deposit or the bonds which bank has issued. So everything of this kind goes into tier 2 capital, which again, so when a bank or when a financial institution is assessing a capital adequacy ratio, so they actually look into tier 1 and tier 2, and in Basel 2 it was 4% for tier 1 and 4% for tier 2 also, right? However, in Basel 3 it was said if bank is dealing with a risky thing or risky loan or risky asset, then in that case the bank will have to set aside a 7% of the tier 1 capital, because tier 1 capital is the bank's own asset, bank's own capital, and tier 2 is not bank's own capital, right? That's a deposit coming from deposit and everything, and the bonds and everything, right? So that is again a bit riskier part. Tier 2 capital we can surely understand. So that is how this thing was said. And other than this, banks were also asked to keep a reserve ratio of 2.5% if in case they have a more risk, if there is a more risk in the business that they are doing, the bank were asked to keep an additional 2.5 additional buffer for the riskier asset if there is more risk than the perceived risk which a bank are allowed to have, and they were asked to keep 2.5% buffer. So that means the total becomes 10.5%, Earlier it was only 8%, 8% of the risk weighted asset. So if the risk is more, or the asset where the bank is dealing with the other entities and the loans which the bank is giving, if the risk assessed is more, in that situation a bank would require to even keep 10.5% of the total capital aside to cover or to mitigate the risk which a bank has at its level. So that is what was understood, and that is how it was presented in Basel 3. So it is important to remember here, while we are talking about enhanced minimum capital, so that means one, when things were riskier for the bank was asked to use 7% of the tier 1 capital, not 4%, which was in case of Basel 2 norms. They were using 4% for tier 1, 4% for tier 2, and that is how they're keeping 8% of the riskier asset aside. But in case when the risk is more, or riskiness in the loans or the assets is more, then the bank would be asked to keep 7% of tier 1 capital aside, not just 4%. And apart from this, there would be an additional buffer of 2.5 if it is perceived risk is fairly higher than what is understood. Then there would be a total of 10.5% additional, 10.5% of the entire risk weighted asset. That amount would be kept aside. So that is what we are terming here as enhanced capital requirement. And then coming to the liquidity requirements. Liquidity requirement, what is liquid? Liquid is something which can be converted into cash at its fair value, right? So, and on an immediate basis, you shouldn't be taking time to convert the asset or the thing that you have invested into cash at a moment's time, and that too at a fair value. It should not be that you getting that converted into cash, but at the loss. So that shouldn't be the case. So while we know banks and financial institutions invest into equities and bonds and other things, so it is perceived the liquidity can be lower when the crisis arises. So banks were asked to manage a fair amount of a liquidity coverage ratio also, so that in case of crisis the liquidity can also be maintained in banks. So that is also one of the asks that came into Basel 3, which was not that that wasn't that greater in Basel 2 norms. So it was talked in Basel 3 greatly, and in detail it was talked, and it was said like bank need to maintain a higher liquidity coverage ratio in case bank is dealing into equity and bonds and other derivative products and everything. So it is quite possible the value of those assets or those instruments go down in times of crisis. So therefore the bank also need to factor in this thing and need to have a fair amount of liquidity, especially in times of stress, in terms of financial crisis. They need to have enough liquidity ratio that can cover or take care of at least 30-day period for sure, right? So that is how this thing actually came into picture. Also, there is one more point that was talked about, that is the leverage ratio. Like banks can also borrow money. They can also borrow money, and they can use that money for debt financing and other things, right? So that was also one of the prime thing that was talked about. So to bank, how much leverage ratio they can have. So that was also minimized in case of in this Basel 3 norms, right? So this is more or less in pillar 1. Moving on to the pillar 2. So that is enhanced supervisory review process for firm-wide risk management and capital planning. So if we look at this thing, can we see it is mentioned firm-wide risk management and capital planning. So if you compare it with Basel 2, Basel 2 does talk about supervisory review and process, but in Basel 3 this has become enhanced. So enhanced in a sense this thing wherein the supervisory review process was there in Basel 2, it was more from the industry perspective. So the industry, when you say the real estate industry, it can be your financial industry, it can be your manufacturing industry. So this is how the supervisory review process was designed in a sense, right? So however, here the risk was designed from the perspective of everything, from the entity level, the firm wide level, or the process level. This thing was designed, and it was assessed like enhanced supervisory review process should be happening for every firm wide risk will be assessed. That is how the pillar 2 is mentioned here. Then coming to pillar 3, the pillar 3 against is also, if you look at here, it is enhanced risk disclosure and market discipline. So here the disclosure is the disclosure which were done before also, which were there only. It is just the information should be widely circulated to the investors by various modes and mediums, so that investors are actually aware about their rights and they are knowing about those things very strongly. They should not be in doubt about those things, like how things are happening. So that way the disclosure became very talked about thing, like they should be disclosing everything. There shouldn't be anything that is hidden, and the customer should be, or investor should be more aware. And that is how even when we talk about MiFID thing, that is also as a result of pillar 3 Basel. So other laws also came into picture, which also talked about, which strengthen investor confidence, investor disclosure information and everything. So those things were taken care of in other laws also. So that is also put into pillar 3 of the Basel 3, that made it more strong. In a sense, the investor would be more aware. If investors are more aware, they can actually demand bank, they can ask bank to share statement, they can ask bank to give more information, and that way the overall banking system can look strong, and it can be very well connected with the other industries as well as and other financial institutions as well. So this is the Basel 3 that we have covered right now. Now I will just do one more slide, then I'll wrap it up because we don't have much time to cover then. So I'll just be covering the next slide and then I will stop it there only. Okay, so this is okay, so there we really have a lot of detail. So the one that we talked about, it is quite the same thing. Leverage ratio, counter-cyclical buffer, and minimum equity capital. So let's go with this first one, better capital quality. So in Basel 3, so stricter definition of capital, higher loss absorbing capacity. So as we talked about in Basel 3, banks would require to have more of tier 1 capital than of tier 2 capital. So that is what the better capital quality is meant here. When you talked about better capital quality, that basically means bank would require to have more capital from tier 1 rather than from tier 2, right? Because tier 1, so if they use tier 1 capital more rather than the tier 2 capital. So if the bank is dealing in the riskier asset, then they should be keeping aside 7% of tier 2. And if you look at this capital conservation buffer, which is 2.5%, this also we talked about in capital requirement. So this is also one of the agenda point in Basel 3, wherein bank was told to keep 2.5% additional buffer in case they are really dealing with a heavier riskier assets or counterparties or entities, then there is a need to keep a 2.5% buffer additional, or you can say over and above what the capital adequacy ratio actually talks about. So capital adequacy ratio talks about 8%, we all know. So that means if I add 2.5%, the capital adequacy becomes 10.5%. So if a bank is dealing with a riskier entity, so riskier counterparty, riskier loans bank has, the bank would require to keep 2.5% additional over and above the 8%. And also the 8% that we are talking about is the 7%, or the higher part of the capital should be coming from tier 1 capital, not from tier 2 capital. That was also the agenda point in Basel 3. What is cyclical buffer? Buffer will range from 0 to 2.5%, consisting of common equity or other fully loss absorbing capital. So again, this can go from 0% to 2.5% additional. So this again goes to, this is a kind of a risk which a bank has if they are dealing with a product which has a domino effect, right? So if one product fails, and if they have a domino effect on those product or those financial instruments which they're dealing into, so there is a probability like it may lead to a more risk in the bank or in the financial institution at large. So that is how it was assessed, like if they have something interlinked, something which is dependent on something else, and if that something else fails, then there is a probability this product also fails. So this is more for the derivative products, you can say, wherein one product has a dependency on the other product. That is how the counter cyclical buffer actually came into existence. And again, if we look at this thing, this talks about fully absorbing capital. So that means it should also come from tier 1 capital. It shouldn't come from tier 2 capital, rather from the tier 1 capital. Minimum equity in capital requirement, when I move on, the minimum requirement from common equity has been raised to 4.5% of total risk asset, and the overall tier 1 capital requirement raised from minimum 4% of 6%. So this was a minimum requirement. So in Basel 3, the minimum requirement for common equity has been raised to 4.5% total risk asset, and overall tier 1 capital requirement raised from current minimum 4% to 6%. 6% was the minimum thing, right? That was raised in Basel 3. And also out of 6%, the 4.5% should be from the equity thing that the bank need to have in Basel 3. Leverage, as we talked about, leverage ratio is the debt which a bank has. So how much debt a bank can take, that is also capped in this Basel 3, to put a cap on swelling of leverage in the banking sector on a global basis. So that is also talked about. That was also mentioned in leverage in Basel 3. Then talking to liquidity ratio. So that is called liquidity coverage ratio. Again, it is coming from from with these two terms we will be talking in greater length in the other slides. This LCR, CRR, and net stable funding ratio. So these are the few terms which are also quite important for every one of us, because we should be clear what these ratios should look like and how these ratios are, what net stability funding ratio actually means. It is calculated for a period of 30 days initially. How bank can sustain for 30 days. So that is the net stable funding ratio, and there is a ratio which again comes with this liquidity ratio, in a sense like bank invest in equity and various other products. So they should be careful or mindful about the fact like how they would be able to manage the liquidity when they're investing in products of this kind. And when the global crisis comes, so these products are actually devalued. When they are devalued, so would they be capable enough to have enough liquidity in that crunch time or in the crisis time? That is something is governed by liquidity coverage ratio and net stability funding ratio. So this we would be talking maybe in the next class, maybe in today's class, we can tomorrow's class rather, we can talk about this thing, or maybe in the other slides we would be having that, and we would be covering this thing. So more or less what we talked in this slide, this is the similar thing that we have in this slide that I give you the explanation. The similar thing is there. The only it is mentioned and given in the in statements and all. So that is what is there, and that's all for today we have. and then the remaining slide will be, so Basel norms are quite important, so we should be clear with the Basel norms, all three norms which are there. Even the Basel 3 is not fully implemented across the globe. Even India is not compliant to Basel 3 as of now. So by 2020, India should be compliant with Basel 3 as well. So any question, maybe you have anything you want to talk maybe before I close it?
No, sir.
Okay, guys. So I'm closing. I'm ending the meeting. We'll meet tomorrow at the same time, 9. Okay.
Okay, sir. Okay.
See you. Bye.
Okay. Bye bye. See you. Bye.
Okay. Bye. Bye.